He entered the train as if he had seen the worst of humanity, and survived. His worn shoes scuffed the metal floor. His thick coat hid a thin but firm body. Ray Dawson, 78, was just another dull face among so many on that ordinary night on the New York subway. While the others boarded in a hurry, headphones on and eyes glued to screens, he simply looked for a seat at the back. Not out of habit, but out of instinct. Ray always observed from where he could see everything, without being noticed. No one there knew his name. To many, he was just the quiet old man, a guy who no one asked where he came from or where he was going. But at the end of the day, in that cold, indifferent train car, Ray carried more than just the newspaper folded under his arm. He carried memories that still burned like gunpowder, wounds that time had not erased, and trained senses that had never been turned off. Two teenagers laughed loudly near the door. A man in a suit dozed with his head down. A mother tried to entertain her son with a bag of cookies. And Ray? Ray just watched, not with judgment, with precision. His tired eyes scanned the car in silence, recording the tiny gestures that almost no one sees. A nervous leg bouncing, a glance away, a clenched fist. Have you ever felt like someone next to you carries a story that would change everything, if it were told? The subway entered a dark tunnel, and a brief shudder ran along the tracks. The lights dimmed. A subtle shudder in the power system. The passengers didn't care, they were used to technical glitches by now, but Ray didn't. He noticed the long pause between the clicks. He noticed the sound of the engine going silent. And then there was silence. That strange, dense silence that seemed to shrink the air around it. The train stopped, in the middle of the tunnel, without warning, without explanation. For a few seconds no one reacted, until a scream cut through the air like a gunshot. "Everyone stay where you are." A man stood up abruptly from the middle seat, dark coat, sweaty face, glassy eyes, a revolver in his hands. He shouted disjointed words, jumbled sentences, orders that no one understood. The train exploded in panic. People screamed, threw themselves on the floor, tried to hide behind benches. A father grabbed his daughter. A woman began to pray out loud. Despair spread like wildfire. But Ray didn't move. Staring at the attacker, he simply exhaled slowly. His breath was long, as if he were preparing for something he had already faced before. Fear did not come. Memory came. Deep down, beneath the noise of the tracks and the chaos, something in him had awakened. Something that had been dormant for decades. During the war he had a gift, calming soldiers in a rage, restraining them with words, disarming them with presence. He was the man sent when the trigger was already trembling, when the worst seemed inevitable. And now in that crowded train car, the same scenario was repeated. The same cold sweat in the wrong hands, the same tension in the air. The difference was that now no one knew who he was, but he knew what to do. And then, with a slight thrust of his arms, Ray stood up. Every muscle complained, his spine protested, but he went, as if he were going to the bathroom, hunched over, silent, slow. The gunman noticed him, took aim, shouted again, "I told you not to move, old man." But Ray didn't answer. What no one in that car knew is that the man walking toward the gun had faced much worse. Stay with me. What you're about to discover next may change the way you see the heroes around you. Because what Ray carried, it wasn't just a war story. It was a lesson in humanity hidden in silence. And just when chaos seemed about to erupt, he did something no one expected. The gun gleamed in the train's flickering lights, which flickered between yellowish-white and pitch-black. The man's shouts grew louder and louder, the words coming out like gunshots. "They're following me. Where's my brother? Get out of here!" The tip of the gun trembled, but his finger was steady on the trigger. Ray still didn't move. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the slightest rash gesture would be enough to trigger the worst. On the bench next to him, a white-haired woman was trying to hide her purse on her lap. Her eyes were wide, her chest heaving. A child was crying softly behind a bench, and a young man was filming everything with his cell phone, as if it were just another video for social media. But Ray, he was just watching. And when his eyes fixed on the attacker's breathing, short, uneven, interrupted by suppressed sobs, he recognized it. That wasn't hatred. It was despair. A despair that came from within, from a place as dark as that tunnel where the train had stopped. Ray placed his palm on the seat in front of him and pushed himself forward slightly. He felt the stiffness in his joints, the familiar pain in the knee he had operated on after a fall in 1993. But he went. One step, then another, slowly. The man shouted, "I told you not to move." Ray didn't stop. He just raised one of his hands as if to say, "Calm down." The tension in the car was so strong that it was in the air. A metallic smell of fear, of sweat, a collective terror that grows in seconds but takes lifetimes to erase. And then he stopped 6 feet away from the man, tall, thin, his face partially covered by a sweaty hood. He was shaking. He was sweating. He was crying. But no one there saw him. No one there wanted to see him. Ray did. He saw the boy who had lost himself. And he remembered. In Vietnam, Ray had spent weeks in a mud bunker, trying to stop a young soldier from killing himself with his own gun. A 19-year-old boy who could no longer tell his enemies from his friends, who saw ghosts in every bush, who talked to his dead mother in the wee hours of the morning. Ray had stayed with him until the end. He had never forgotten his face, and now, before him, it was not the same boy, but the same kind of pain. The same cracked mind, the same look of help, albeit disguised as threat. Ray took another step. The man pointed the gun straight at his chest. The car held its breath. And then, instead of speaking out loud, Ray whispered. A short sentence, inaudible to the others. But it made the man blink. A second sentence. The assailant hesitated. A third. His hands shook, his knees too. The revolver, previously raised in fury, now began to lower. And when Ray lightly touched his arm with his fingertips, the man collapsed. He fell to his knees. He wept like a lost child. The gun slipped from his hand, slid across the floor, and came to rest at the feet of a young woman who was shaking so much she couldn't even pick it up. No one understood what had happened, but everyone saw it, and yet they still didn't know who that silent man was, who had faced danger head-on, without raising his voice. Ray crouched down, held the man's shoulders in a fit of rage, and continued speaking softly. His face was close to his, as if they were old acquaintances. The train car, once a field of shouting, was completely silent. No one dared interrupt. Then he made a gesture with his hand, discreet, technical, as if he were asking no one to come closer. A woman tried to say something, but a young man held her back and said, "Leave him alone. He knows what he's doing." And he knew. The heavy footsteps of the police echoed through the dark gallery. Commanding voices came from far away, the sound of the emergency gate being forced open, and even with the armed officers ready to storm in, Ray didn't move. He remained there, on the cold floor, his hands on the shoulders of the man who had been subdued, who was now crying like a repentant son in the arms of a father he never had. When the police came in, the first question they asked was, "Who disarmed the man?" Everyone pointed. But Ray again said nothing. He struggled to his feet, took a deep breath, and returned to his seat. He sat in the back seat. He stared at his reflection in the dark window, and he sat there. An agent approached him. "Your name, sir?" He hesitated. "Ray." And then nothing else. She glanced at his coat. An old military ID card, folded and worn with age, slipped discreetly from the pocket. A silver symbol gleamed for a second before being hidden by the fold of the fabric, but no one there paid attention. Shortly after, the passengers began to leave the train, one by one, led away by the police. The man with the gun was taken away on a stretcher, sedated. And Ray just remained. He only got up when everyone had left. He walked slowly along the empty platform, as if he knew the path by heart. He took the elevator without rushing. He left the station and disappeared into the cold early morning crowd. A few hours later, the news was already showing shaky images recorded by cell phones. Headlines tried to explain the inexplicable. Elderly man disarms attacker on subway. Veteran saves dozens with words. Unknown hero disappears after act of courage. But none of the versions explained the most important thing. Ash did. or because. As the city woke up, there was no television on in Ray's small apartment. He simply made coffee, took out a notebook with a faded blue cover and wrote a single line. One more saved. There's still time. After that, he went back to his routine. And the next day, there he was again, on the same back seat, in the same carriage, with the same attentive gaze. Because deep down he knew, the world keeps turning, but the ghosts keep getting on board. If this story touched you, comment below. There are people who carry much more than they seem to. The train was still stopped. Outside, the darkness of the tunnel seemed to swallow any hope of rescue. The passengers huddled together, clutching each other, as if time had frozen at the exact moment the man raised his gun. But inside Ray, time had not stopped. He had returned. Not to that subway, but to a muddy field in the middle of the jungle, where the heat came not just from the sun, but from fear. It was 1971. The mission was simple on paper: locate missing soldiers and scout the area. But what they found was a young man, Nick, just 19, clutching his dead brother's body. He was surrounded by dried blood, covered in leaves, his gun pointed at anyone who came near. Ray was the only one who didn't point back. He sat beside him, out of uniform, speechless, just breathing along with him, for hours, until the boy put down his rifle and cried. That day he saved 2 men, the boy and Ray. Now, half a century later, history was repeating itself in a twisted but familiar way. A face collapsing, a gun shaking, and a crowd about to become statistics. Ray knew. He knew that all it took was one wrong word, one misinterpreted expression, and chaos would erupt. It was a blind dance with death, where every gesture mattered. He stood up as if he had forgotten that he no longer had the same agility. Every bone seemed to protest. But he went. Slowly, he passed the astonished looks of the people crouching, as if he were going to the end of the line to catch a train that would not come. The armed man stopped walking. He froze. Ray realized he recognized something. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was the way Ray approached, without fear but with humanity, like someone who does not see a criminal, but a cry for help. The attacker began to speak to him, at first angrily, then hesitantly. He said that his brother had disappeared, that no one was listening, that he needed to get attention. The words came out jumbled, but Ray could hear clearly what was behind them. Abandonment, guilt, disorientation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about unresolved pain, untreated trauma, and a stifled mind that found no escape but fear. And then something inside Ray shook, not because of the gun, but because of the mirror that stood before him. Because what he saw in that young man was the reflection of what he himself could have become. How many times had he come back from war thinking no one cared? How many nights had he woken up with sweat running down his face, hearing explosions that no longer existed? How many times had he tried to scream inside, but found no ears? He knew exactly how that man felt, because he had been in the same hole. The difference was that Ray had back then someone who had pulled him back out, even if it was just a thread of voice, even if it was at the limit of his endurance. Now he was that thread for another man. And that was why, when he was less than 2 paces away, Ray spoke. Quietly, almost like a prayer. He said the name of a battalion that no one outside the war knew, then the name of a base, a code. The gun began to lower. The man was shaking. Anger was giving way to confusion. Ray spoke again. He whispered something about loss, about brothers, about surviving when he no longer wanted to. The man fell to his knees. The gun slipped from his fingers. Ray gently nudged it under the seat with his foot. Then he bent down, placing his hand gently on the back of his neck, the way he used to do to soldiers in Vietnam when they were in a panic. The car was completely silent, but inside Ray's mind, there was too much noise. It was at that moment that he felt the weight of the memory hit him hard, like a crack in his chest, the same feeling he had when he saw his best friend die because he had failed to disarm another young soldier, because he had tried to use force instead of listening. That never left him. Ray had lived with that dormant guilt for decades, and now, as if fate had returned to the scene of the crime, he had the chance to do things differently. While everyone there just saw a brave old man, he carried another hidden truth, that of someone who still blamed himself, who still suffered, who still woke up in the middle of the night wondering if it was worth it. He wasn't looking for applause. He just wanted to avoid another tragedy, and so he gave himself to the moment with everything he had left. Body, mind, soul, and all the pain that was never said out loud. The police arrived soon after, guns drawn, voices of command. Shouts for everyone to move away. Ray remained crouched. He didn't move until he was sure the man was safe. When he stood up, the policeman's gaze fell on him. "Was that you?" Ray didn't answer. He just went back to his seat in the back, sat down, arranged the newspaper on his lap and stared at his own reflection in the dark subway window, as if he were acknowledging that there were still battles going on inside, even when everything outside seemed calm. Now that you know this part of the journey, maybe it's time to take a closer look at what's around us. At the people sitting at the back of the bus, at the people walking in silence on the sidewalks. Because often, true heroes don't wear uniforms, they wear scars. Write in the comments. Some battles continue in silence. The armed man was breathing as if he had been running for hours, even though he hadn't moved from the spot. His face was covered in sweat. His eyes were wide, and his hands, those hands were shaking so much that the barrel of the gun vibrated with them. He had lost control of the situation, of his mind, of his body. But at that moment in front of him, there was someone who didn't waver. An old man with a hunched walk who pretended not to hear the screams, who defied fear with slow steps, who ignored the gun as if he had seen worse. Ray stopped, exactly 2 steps away from the man. The entire carriage shrank back. The little girl in her father's arms had her face hidden under her coat. Her father's eyes said it all. "Please don't shoot." A young man with headphones still around his neck held back his tears with his hand covering his mouth. Behind a column, a pregnant woman was murmuring something that sounded like a prayer, and the silence that filled the carriage was the kind of silence that only appears when death seems too close. "I'm talking to you," the armed man shouted, pointing the revolver directly at Ray's chest. But Ray didn't answer, didn't stop, didn't flinch. He just looked. A firm look, not of defiance, but of presence. A look that said, "I see you," not as a criminal, but as someone who had broken inside, someone who had not been heard at the right time, and who now screamed, with a gun in his hands, the scream he had never had the courage to let out before. At that moment, the unexpected happened. The man froze. It was as if an anchor had been dropped across his chest, as if time had stopped. His eyes met Ray's, and instead of hatred, there was confusion, uncertainty, fear. But not of the old man in front of him. Fear of himself. "You," the man murmured. Ray finally broke the silence. He spoke softly, almost imperceptibly. "No one will hurt you here." The man swallowed hard. The gun was still pointed, but his arms began to give way. The tension that kept him standing began to crumble. He didn't understand why, but something about that old man moved him in a way he couldn't explain. Ray took half a step forward and spoke again. "I know what you lost." Those words fell like a brick on the man's chest. He staggered, his eyes filled with tears. The hand holding the gun was now shaking uncontrollably, and at that moment something no one expected happened. He began to cry, a stifled, ugly, suppressed cry. The cry of someone who had held everything in for years, decades perhaps. The revolver slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a dry thud. But no one in the carriage moved, because everyone was still stuck on the image of Ray standing there, standing in the face of a breakdown. Not with strength, but with humanity. Not with shouting, but with presence. The man fell to his knees. He began to mumble incoherent sentences. He apologized. He repeated names. "My brother, I just wanted them to know." Ray knelt down beside him, even though his body ached. Even though his age weighed on him. He reached out and touched the man's shoulder, With his other hand, he gestured, almost invisible, as if to warn, "Don't come any closer." It was as if he had taken command of a psychological battlefield, and on that battlefield no one had more authority than he did. Little by little, the tension began to dissolve. The girl stopped crying. The pregnant woman ran her hand over her belly and took a deep breath. A young man took his earphones off his neck and put them away as if to apologize for having ignored everything up until that point. And Ray was still kneeling, listening, just listening. This scene lasted just a few minutes, but inside, it seemed like an eternity. And then the metallic sound of the side door opened. 3 police officers burst in with guns drawn, shouting orders. Ray turned slowly, palms exposed, and pointed at the ground, where the gun lay away from the attacker, now surrendered and in tears. "He won't fight back," Ray said. His voice was firm, quiet, with the authority of someone who had held dying soldiers in his arms. The policemen hesitated, but they obeyed. Instead of grabbing the man on the ground, they simply surrounded him. And one of them, looking directly at Ray, asked, "Who are you, sir?" Ray didn't answer. He just stood up, his body heavy, and walked back to the back seat. He sat down, he put his hands on his knees, and he stayed there, as if nothing had happened, as if he had just moved. But there was more to the silence, because no one there knew that, inside, Ray was broken. That scene had left scars, old ones, deep ones. He remembered his son. Yes, Ray had a son, and he lost him. Not to war, but to depression, years ago. The boy had come back from military service quiet, then isolated. Then he never came back. Ray has blamed himself every day since then for not doing what he did today, for not listening, for not reading the signs, for being too harsh. And that night, when he saw that man with the gun, Ray saw his son, not his face, but the pain, the same look his boy had had before he left. And there, in that train car, he had the chance to do for another what he couldn't do for the one he loved most. And that's what saved everyone. Ray wasn't just a veteran. He was a grieving father, a man who carried guilt too heavy for an aging heart. But in that moment he found a form of redemption that didn't come with applause, but with silence. As paramedics carried the attacker out, still handcuffed and in shock, and passengers began to leave under police direction, a young woman approached Ray. She looked at him with teary eyes and said simply, "Thank you, sir. You saved my daughter's life." Ray didn't say anything. He just nodded. And while everyone left the carriage, he stayed, a few more minutes, as if he still needed to take a deep breath before returning to the surface, because his hardest battle was still inside. Write it down. Not all wars take place on the battlefield. As the first agents entered the car, their eyes swept the scene with brutal urgency, expecting to find chaos, screams, blood. But they found silence, a dense, almost sacred silence. The man who minutes before had been threatening dozens of lives with a revolver in his hands was now kneeling, his head bowed, sobbing like a lost child. And in front of him, standing like a calm shadow in the midst of the hurricane, was Ray, his hand resting on his shoulder as if to say, "It's over, you're still here." One of the officers shouted, "Who disarmed the suspect?" But no one answered. They just looked toward the old man in the back of the car. One of them approached Ray cautiously, as if approaching something he didn't understand. "Sir, are you okay?" Ray nodded slightly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The gun was still on the floor beside the bench, pushed discreetly away. The cop's eyes trailed to it, then back to Ray. He could sense there was something different about the old man. It wasn't just courage. It was something deeper. An authority that wasn't imposed by uniform, but by soul, by pain, by presence. Ray struggled to his feet. His legs were shaking, not from fear, but from age. His joints creaked softly. One of the agents reached out to help him, but Ray calmly raised his own, refusing. He still wanted to carry what he could on his own. No matter how much the weight of the world insisted on bending his shoulders, he still hadn't forgotten how to stand up straight. And that was saying a lot. As the police led the subdued assailant out, the passengers began to stand up one by one. Some were still crying. Others just watched, unsure of what to think. A woman in a suit, visibly shaken, whispered something that Ray heard as he passed. "I'll never forget this." But he didn't answer. He just walked slowly to the end of the car, where he had left the old newspaper, now wet with sweat. There was a time when Ray was also screaming inside, a time when he also felt like no one was listening to him. When he returned from the war, he had visible scars on his body, but invisible ones on his soul. He lost his marriage. He grew apart from his daughter. He saw friends take their own lives while he insisted on living, even though he didn't know exactly why. He tried to adapt to civilian life, but everything seemed too fast, too cold, too superficial. The noise of the city bothered him. The blank stares on the streets made him feel even more alone. And whenever he tried to talk, people looked away, as if they were afraid to touch that past. Ray learned to keep quiet, to become invisible, to simply occupy spaces like the back seat of a train, where no one asked him anything, where he could observe the world with the distance that his pain demanded. But that didn't mean he had given up. Quite the opposite. In every silence, he waited for a chance. A moment when he could finally use everything he knew to do something worthwhile. And that moment arrived. It wasn't in front of cameras nor on a stage, but in a dark, dirty subway car in Manhattan full of panicked strangers. There, he was heard by someone everyone thought was irredeemable, and it was this listening that prevented the worst. No screams, no gunshots, no violence. As he climbed the stairs to the station, the sky was still dark. The city was beginning to wake up. The noise of cars, horns, and hurried voices. But Ray walked slowly, with firm steps, as if he were walking not only forward, but also within himself. He could feel his heart beating more clearly. It wasn't euphoria, it was peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. But he knew that was not the end. At breakfast, a headline awaited him. The TV behind the counter showed a shaky cell phone image. The caption read, "Elderly man prevents New York subway tragedy." A reporter was talking about the police action. No mention of the action that actually prevented the disaster. No names, no faces. Ray smiled inwardly. He preferred it that way. The cafe attendant, a young man in his early 20s, placed the coffee cup on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Hey, sir, is that you in this video?" Ray looked up and saw the boy's cell phone screen. It was him, clearly him. The image showed the moment he was kneeling before the man in a fit. The scene went viral. Comments popped up underneath. "Hero's example. The world needs more Rays." He just replied, "I just did what needed to be done." The boy didn't insist. He just smiled and went back to the counter. And Ray picked up a pen, opened the newspaper, and in an empty corner wrote a single sentence. Sometimes all you have to do is listen. Because deep down he knew his mission wasn't over yet. As long as there were people screaming inside, he would continue to be the old man in the background, silent, attentive, present. A kind of hero that no one expects, but who changes everything when he shows up. Write in the comments, listening can also save. At the next station, the noise of the crowd returned to its usual frenetic rhythm. Backpacks banging, sneakers squeaking on the worn floor, muffled announcements over the loudspeakers. No one seemed to know what had happened moments before in that car, but Ray knew. And more than that, he felt it in his body. Every cell in his body seemed to carry the silent weight of what had not made headlines. While the newspapers searched for a face to print the heroism of the previous night, Ray walked back to the back bench, silent, invisible, but whole. The train left. A new group boarded. Time went on as if nothing had been interrupted, and in a way, that was what hurt the most. The world didn't seem to care about what he had done. It wasn't that he wanted applause, he had forgotten how to expect anything from others. But there was a bitter feeling in his chest, that even when everything changes on the inside, on the outside, everything remains the same. Ray took the folded credential out of his backpack pocket. the same one he had kept hidden for years, in an envelope stained with coffee and longing. Major Ray Dawson, Psychological Containment Unit, Expeditionary Force, Vietnam. Almost no one knew what it meant, not even his daughter. He never explained, not for lack of opportunity, but for fear of not being understood. For years, he kept quiet about what he did in that war. Not only out of obligation, but out of shame. Most men wanted to come back with stories of glory, of victories on the field. But he had come back with stories of broken boys, of outbursts in the middle of the jungle, of missions where the enemy was trauma and the weapon was the wire. No one wanted to hear about it. It was easier to glorify shooting than to value silence. One time he tried to tell the pastor of his church. It was one winter morning after church. The pastor smiled, listened to 3 sentences, and then changed the subject. He said that God had plans. Ray nodded, but inside, he felt even more alone. That conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The silence that followed lasted decades, and now, sitting on that metal bench, his knees aching and his hands shaking from the bad coffee, Ray wondered how many other veterans like him were still wandering around. How many were in silent houses, on park benches, in forgotten hospitals, carrying memories that no one ever wanted to hear. He looked out the window. A man got on the plane with his son on his shoulders. The child laughed. A pure, free sound. Ray felt his eyes burn. His grandson would be that age today if Ray's son was still here, if he hadn't slipped into the dark crevice of depression that no one saw in time. And once again, the pain came back like a cold wave, because every life he saved out there couldn't erase the one he lost inside. But that day, something subtle happened. As he got off the subway, Ray decided to walk to a community center he had seen once, near where he and his wife used to live. It was a small space with wide windows and posters taped to the glass, support group for veterans, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. He stopped in front of the door. He thought about leaving. But something inside him, maybe the pain, maybe the tiredness, asked for one more chance. He came in. The smell of instant coffee and old paper hit him first. Then came the eyes of the people present, 7 men and 2 women, all between 50 and 80 years old. Someone laughed. Someone coughed. A white-haired lady invited him to sit down with her eyes, and he did. The coordinator asked if anyone wanted to share anything that night. Ray looked up. Time seemed to stop. "Last night, I was on the subway," he began, his voice low. "A man, armed, in crisis. I disarmed him, without force, only with words. I learned that a long time ago, in a jungle that no one remembers anymore." Silence. But not that hard silence from before. It was different. A listening silence. "They call me a hero today, but I only did what I couldn't do with my son." The coordinator nodded, his eyes welling up. "And how was it for you to say that now?" Ray took a deep breath. His chest felt lighter. The lump in his throat was finally beginning to loosen. As if for the first time I had returned home. A lady next to him gently held his hand. He didn't pull away. And then, in that modest setting, no cameras, no headlines, no medals, Ray was heard. For the first time he felt that he no longer had to carry everything alone, that he could little by little share his baggage, that his pain was not unique but shareable, that the silence that suffocated him could also free him, and it was there, in that circle of plastic chairs and styrofoam cups, that Ray found what neither the war, nor the city, nor the years had been able to give: belonging. Comment here. Some wounds only heal when they are heard. He held the cup with both hands, as if trying to warm it more than just his fingers, as if he needed to warm his chest from the inside. The coffee was strong, without sugar, exactly as he always drank it. The noise from the street filtered through the dirty windows of the place, mixed with the sounds of the old radio that was playing some random jazz station. At that corner table, close to the wall, Ray seemed like just another regular customer. But the waiter knew, and the boy's eyes still returned to him from time to time, as if trying to understand who that man really was. Ray didn't care. He was used to curious looks and questions that never came. Life had taught him that people only ask what they're ready to hear, and few, very few were. At the next table, two veterans were quietly talking about overdue pensions and back pain. One of them, wearing a navy blue beret, was talking about a friend who had been hospitalized after a nervous breakdown. "The guy was a hero in the Gulf, and now nobody even remembers he exists," he said. Ray didn't answer, but he closed his eyes for a moment. Because it was true. The country's memory was short, the neighbors even shorter, the veterans' pain too long. And even with all that bubbling up inside, Ray remained silent. The kind of silence that isn't the absence of words. It's protection, a shield built over time, over loss, over disappointment. And now, even after what happened on the subway, he knew the world wouldn't change because of a single gesture, but something inside him that had changed. For the first time in a long time, Ray felt like he had done something that didn't need to be explained. A complete act, whole. That required no apologies or justifications. That existed only because he had the courage to act when no one else knew how. And even without an audience, without a trophy, without a headline, it had been worth it all. But there was still something bothering him, a lump that lingered in his throat, not about the night before, but about what still needed to be resolved, something that for years he had pushed to the back of his mind, like someone locking a door for fear of what might escape. His daughter's name, for example, Margaret. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 years, 7 maybe. Not since that dinner where everything fell apart. She wanted him to be more present, more sensitive, more of a father. He responded with silence, then with rudeness. He said things he regretted before he even finished the sentence. Things like, "You don't understand what I've been through," or "I raised you, now leave me alone." And she did. She took her grandchildren. She took her own pain, and left his even more exposed. Since then, Ray has written letters she never sent. Some short with a single sentence, "I miss you." Others long, filled with memories of the time when she would jump in bed to Marvin Gaye records, but they all ended up torn up, or burned in the ashtray, as if the guilt would turn to ash along with the paper. That morning, however, something different happened. As he walked out of the cafe, his coat zipped up to his neck and the newspaper tucked under his arm, Ray saw a figure standing across the street. It was a woman, her arms crossed, leaning against a lamppost. She was wearing a red coat. She was looking straight at him. For a second, he thought he was mistaken, but it wasn't. Margaret. She looked younger than he remembered, or maybe just more alive. Her face held hurt, but also a strange tenderness, as if she somehow knew, as if she had felt something that night when he had faced the unknown, and somehow she had been touched too. Ray stopped on the sidewalk. The world around them kept moving, cars, horns, pedestrians, but the two of them stood still, separated by a crosswalk and a decade of silence. He didn't know what to say. He didn't even know if he should cross. His heart raced as if on a mission. But it was another kind of fear, a fear that cannot be overcome with tactics or maneuvers. It was the fear of not being forgiven. Then she did something simple. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. She held it up in the air as if to say, "I got it." And Ray understood. One of those letters had not been burned. He had dropped it, perhaps on purpose, on her doorstep months before. And she had read it, even in silence. She nodded slightly and started walking towards him. His heart, old and calloused, could barely cope. The wind blew hard. The pages of the newspaper slipped from his arm and flew across the sidewalk like the dead leaves of a late autumn. But Ray didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't care what was blowing away. If you've made it this far, you may have felt the same way many people feel, but can't always put it into words, that sometimes what really changes a life is a silent listen, a discreet gesture, a reunion that seemed impossible. And if this story touched something inside you, then every second we've spent together so far has been worth it. If stories like this make sense to you, if they help you see the world with a little more empathy, courage, and truth, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video carries something deeper. It's not just about veterans, it's about real people. and about the strength that continues even when no one applauds. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "I would have sat on the bench with him." That's how I know who stayed until the end, who really felt it, and who walks along on this journey. And if this video caught your attention in a special way, leave a like. It's just a click away, but it helps keep this conversation alive, flowing, the way it needs to be. There's a video here on the side that continues along these lines. Click and come with me. The next story might bring an answer you didn't even know you needed.